The smell of smoke reached the lane before the sound of the bell did, a thin grey thread unspooling over the hedgerows of Ashcombe village, and Elinor Wren was already running before she understood why. She had been carrying a basket of mended linens back from the Hartley farm, her arms full, her boots still damp from the morning's rain. When she rounded the bend by the old chestnut and saw it, Ashcombe Hall, the great house on the hill, wearing a crown of fire. Flames licked along the west wing's upper windows, orange tongues curling out into the grey afternoon like something alive and starving. Smoke rolled black and thick from a shattered pane on the second floor. Down below, on the gravel sweep before the entrance, a knot of people stood frozen, some weeping, some simply staring, as though the sight before them were too enormous to permit action. A stable boy tugged uselessly at a terrified horse. An old groundsman stood with a single bucket of water held slack in his hand, as if he had forgotten what buckets were for. Elinor dropped the basket into the mud without a second thought. She did not know, in that first breathless moment, who lived in that house, or whose name was carved above its door, or what manner of man owned the land she was crossing at a dead run. She knew only that the house was burning, and that people were inside it, and that no one on that gravel sweep seemed prepared to go and get them. "Is anyone still inside?" she called out, breathless, to the nearest woman, a housemaid with soot already smudged across her cheek and terror written plain across her face. The kitchen girls, Mrs. Pruitt, she went back for the silver, and I don't know if she came out again, and cook's boy went in after her, and the maid's words dissolved into sobs, and Elinor did not wait to hear the rest. She tore the shawl from her shoulders, dipped it into the ornamental fountain at the foot of the steps, and pressed it wet against her nose and mouth before she went through the front doors, into a hallway thick with smoke. The heat struck her first, a wall of it, pressing against her skin like a hand. The air inside was a strange twilight, grey and gold and moving, and somewhere above her she could hear a groaning sound, wood complaining under its own weight, the house itself protesting the violence being done to it. She kept low, the way her father had once taught her when a chimney fire had nearly taken their own cottage years before. "Stay beneath the smoke," he'd said. "It rises before it kills you." And she had never forgotten it, though she had never imagined she would need it in a house such as this. She found Mrs. Pruitt first, collapsed near the base of the servants' stair, a canvas sack of silver spoons clutched absurdly to her chest, coughing so hard she could not stand. Elinor hauled the older woman's arm over her shoulder, and half carried, half dragged her back toward the door, out into air that tasted. For the first time in her life, like the sweetest thing she had ever breathed, she left Mrs. Pruitt in the arms of two footmen who had finally found their courage, and went back in. This was the part of the story that would later be told and retold in the village, embellished by some, disbelieved by others, but never disputed by anyone who had stood upon that gravel and watched a laundress's daughter walk back into a burning house, not once, not twice, but 4 times, each time emerging with someone coughing and soot-blackened and alive. The 4th time, she found the boy from the kitchens, curled beneath an overturned table in the servants' hall, having fallen and struck his head, too dazed to crawl free on his own. She carried him out over her shoulder, her arms screaming, her lungs raw, her hair singed at one temple where an ember had caught it, and when she laid him down upon the grass and saw his chest rise and fall, she allowed herself, for just a moment, to weep. It was in that moment, soot-streaked, trembling, her borrowed courage nearly spent, that she heard the sound that would change the shape of her life. A man's voice, hoarse with smoke and something rawer than smoke, tore across the chaos of the gravel sweep. "Lucy. Has anyone seen Lucy? Where is my niece? Where is the child?" Elinor turned. The man had come from around the side of the house, his coat gone, his shirt torn and blackened at the sleeve, his face streaked with ash so thoroughly that in the confusion of smoke and shouting she took him, at first, for one of the grooms. He was moving through the crowd of servants and villagers with the particular violence of a man being torn apart from the inside, seizing shoulders, demanding answers, receiving only frightened shakes of the head. The nursery, someone finally said. She was napping in the nursery, in the east wing. The east wing hasn't caught yet, another voice called. But the stair, the main stair is gone. It collapsed not 5 minutes past. The man made a sound then that Elinor would remember for the rest of her days, a sound with no words in it at all. And he turned toward the house as though he meant to walk into the fire with his bare hands. Elinor did not think. She would tell herself later that a wiser woman might have thought, might have weighed the odds, might have asked which door led where and whether the east wing could still be reached. But in that instant there was no thought in her at all, only the image of a sleeping child and a father's voice breaking in two, and her feet were already moving. "There's a servants' passage," she shouted, remembering it from the layout of the great houses she had cleaned for as a girl, before her father's small trade had begun to prosper. Round the back, by the still room, it runs beneath the main stair to the east wing. It might not have caught. The man, she did not yet know him as anything but a man, a father, a stranger in torn linen, turned to her with an expression she could not name, something between disbelief and desperate hope, and said only, "Show me." They ran together around the side of the burning house, past the orangery windows glowing orange with more than sunset, past a fallen statue of some long-dead Roman senator, to a low door half hidden by ivy that led into the servants' passage. The smoke here was thinner, the fire not yet arrived, though the heat pressed close and the air tasted of ash. "Wait," Elinor said, catching his arm as he made to plunge ahead of her. "You don't know these passages. I do. Follow close, and do exactly as I say." Something in her voice, steady where his was not, certain where his was fraying, made him obey her, though she would learn later that this man was not accustomed to being told what to do by anyone, least of all a stranger, in a mud-hemmed dress, with soot upon her face. They went through the passage at a crouching run, Elinor counting doors under her breath the way she remembered counting them as a girl of 12, sent to fetch coal for a household much like this one. The nursery stair, when they found it, was a narrow servants' rise meant for nursemaids carrying trays, untouched yet by the fire that was devouring the grander parts of the house. They climbed it 2 steps at a time, the man's breath ragged behind her, and at the top she pushed open a door into a small room, where a little girl of perhaps 7 years sat upright in a narrow bed, her eyes huge with fright, too frightened even to cry, clutching a wooden horse to her chest. "Uncle Julian," the child said, in a voice so small it broke something loose in Elinor's chest. The man, Julian, she thought, only his given name, nothing more, not yet, crossed the room in 2 strides and gathered the girl into his arms as though he meant never to let her go again, pressing his face into her hair, and for a moment neither of them moved, and Elinor stood in the doorway feeling suddenly and strangely, as though she were intruding upon something too private for a stranger's eyes. "We must go," she said gently, when the moment had stretched as long as it safely could. "The smoke is rising in the main hall. This passage is our best road out, but we oughtn't linger." He looked up at her then, really looked at her, as though seeing her fully for the first time, and something passed across his face that she would spend many quiet evenings afterward trying to understand. Not merely gratitude, though gratitude was there, but something closer to astonishment, the particular astonishment of a man discovering that the world still contained people who ran toward danger instead of away from it. "Lead on," he said simply, and they went back down the narrow stair, the child wrapped in his arms, Elinor going ahead to test each door before they passed through it. And out through the servants' passage into air and grass, and a crowd of people who broke into a ragged cheer at the sight of the child alive. It was only then, as the man sank to his knees upon the lawn with his niece still clutched against his chest, weeping without shame in front of half the village, that Elinor heard someone nearby whisper the words that made the ground seem to tilt beneath her feet. Thank heaven His grace found her in time. His grace. She looked again at the man kneeling in the grass, his ruined shirt, his ash-streaked face, and understood, with a slow and dizzying realization, that she had spent the last quarter hour giving orders to the Duke of Ashcombe himself, that she had told a duke to follow close and do exactly as she said, that she had walked ahead of him through his own house as though she owned every inch of it, and that he had obeyed her without question. She had not known. She had not thought to ask, in the chaos, whose house was burning, or whose name graced the deed. She had thought only of servants trapped, and a child crying for her uncle, and it had not once occurred to her that the man beside her, coughing smoke from his lungs, was Julian Ashworth, 6th Duke of Ashcombe, master of the very estate that had employed half the village for 3 generations. She took a step back, suddenly and acutely aware of her plain wool dress, her cracked boots, the soot upon her hands, and felt the sharp, sudden desire to disappear entirely, before he could look at her again, and see not the woman who had helped him, but merely a laundress's daughter, who had overstepped every boundary that separated her world from his. But he did look at her again, and this time he rose, setting the child gently upon her feet, though Lucy would not release his hand, and crossed the grass toward her with a purposefulness that made Elinor's heart beat harder than the smoke had managed to. "I do not know your name," he said, and his voice, though hoarse, carried the particular clarity of a man unused to being unheard. "Elinor Wren." "Your Grace," she said, and dropped into a curtsy so hasty and so late that it felt almost like an apology. "Miss Wren." He said her name as though testing its weight. "You went into my house 4 times before I ever arrived upon that lawn. I am told this by no fewer than 6 of my own servants, all of whom seem inclined to weep when they say it." He paused, "And then you led me through a passage I confess I had forgotten existed, to find the one person in this world I could not have borne to lose." "Anyone would have done the same," Elinor said, though even as she said it she knew it was not true, for she had seen with her own eyes the villagers standing frozen upon the gravel, buckets forgotten in their hands. "No," he said quietly. "They would not. I have just watched half my household stand and stare at a wall of fire, Miss Wren." "You did not stare." He looked down at his niece, who had finally begun to cry now that the danger had passed, the particular delayed weeping of a child who had been too frightened to weep before. "You did not stare, and because of it, my sister's only child still breathes." Elinor did not know what to say to this. She was aware, distantly, that the fire was still burning behind them, that men had finally organized themselves into a bucket chain from the ornamental pond, that the whole scene had the strange unreality of something she would not fully believe until she woke the next morning and found the burns upon her palms. "I ought to go," she said instead, glancing toward the lane, toward the ordinary world of her father's shop and her mother's kitchen, a world that suddenly felt very far away and very safe. "My family will be worried." "Of course," the Duke said, though something in his face suggested he had not expected her to wish to leave so quickly, as though he had assumed, perhaps rightly, given how most encounters with him tended to go, that she would linger, would seek some acknowledgement, some reward. "But you will allow me to see you home. It is the least I can offer, and I confess I would rest easier knowing you arrived safely, given the state of your hands." Elinor looked down and saw for the first time the raw, reddened skin along her palms and fingers, burns she had not felt until this exact moment, as though the noticing of pain required permission that had not yet been granted amid the chaos. "That is not necessary, your grace," she began, but he had already turned to a groom holding 2 horses steady at a distance from the smoke, and within a few minutes she found herself, absurdly riding in a cart behind the Duke of Ashcombe's own horse, his niece asleep at last against his shoulder, toward her father's small shop on the edge of the village, while half of Ashcombe stood in the road and watched with open mouths. Her mother wept when she saw the burns. Her father, a quiet man not given to displays, gripped Elinor's shoulders so hard it nearly hurt, and said nothing at all for a long moment, simply looking at her as though reassuring himself she was real. The Duke remained only long enough to see her safely through the door, to instruct that his own physician be sent to attend to her hands that very evening, and to say, before he left, words that Elinor would turn over in her mind for many nights afterward. "I do not know how a house repays a debt such as this, Miss Wren. But I intend to discover a way," she thought as she watched his carriage, for a second carriage had arrived by then, grander than the cart, more befitting his station, roll away down the lane, that this would be the whole of it. A dramatic afternoon, a story to tell at the well for weeks to come, a duke's gratitude expressed, and then forgotten as duke's gratitude so often was. She did not imagine, as she sat with her bandaged hands in her lap and her mother fussing over salve and linen, that she had only just begun a story whose true shape she could not yet see. The physician came that evening as promised, a precise, soft-spoken man named Dr. Aldous, who dressed her burns with a gentleness Elinor had not expected from a man in such fine clothes, and who mentioned, almost in passing, that his Grace had asked to be informed personally of Miss Wren's recovery. She thought little of it at the time, assuming it the ordinary courtesy of a great house toward those who had served it in crisis. But 3 days later, when her hands were still wrapped and her burns still tender, a footman arrived at her father's shop, bearing a letter sealed with the Ashcombe crest, and inside it, in a hand both careful and slightly urgent, the Duke asked whether Miss Wren might do him the honour of calling at the hall, once her strength permitted, for his niece had asked after her without ceasing since the fire, and would not, he confessed, be soothed by any assurance but the sight of her rescuer's own face. Elinor's mother nearly fainted at the sight of the ducal seal. Her father read the letter twice, his brow furrowed with the particular suspicion of a tradesman unaccustomed to great houses taking notice of his family, and asked, with careful neutrality, whether Elinor wished to go. She did not know, if she were honest, whether she wished it or feared it more. But she thought of the child's small face in the nursery doorway, the wooden horse clutched so tightly, the way Lucy had said Uncle Julian in a voice too frightened for a child so young, and she found that she could not, in good conscience, refuse a summons from a girl who had nearly lost everything. She went the following week, once the worst of the burns had scabbed and faded to pink, dressed in her one good gown, her hair pinned as carefully as her unpracticed hands allowed. Ashcombe Hall, when she approached it this time by the front drive, rather than at a dead run across the lawn, looked different than it had in the smoke, half its west wing still scorched black and open to the sky, where workmen swarmed with scaffolding and timber. The rest of the great house standing pale and handsome in the autumn light, as though the fire had been merely a fever it had since recovered from. A footman showed her not to some formal receiving room, as she had feared, but to a sunlit nursery on the untouched side of the house, where Lucy sat at a low table attempting, with fierce concentration, to arrange a set of wooden animals into what appeared to be a wedding procession. The child looked up, and her small face transformed entirely, brightening with a joy so unguarded that Elinor felt something in her own chest loosen. "You came," Lucy said, scrambling up and crossing the room to seize Elinor's hand, careful, Elinor noticed, to avoid the places where the skin was still tender. "Uncle Julian said you might not, because ladies who save people are very busy. But I told him you would. I could hardly disappoint someone who had such confidence in me," Elinor said, and allowed herself to be pulled toward the low table and the wooden animals, and it was there, an hour later, kneeling upon a nursery floor, helping a duke's niece decide whether the wooden fox ought to be invited to the wedding of the wooden horse and the wooden sheep that the duke himself found her. He stood in the doorway for a long moment before either of them noticed him, and Elinor would wonder, later, what he had seen in that unguarded moment. A village girl on her knees on his nursery floor, entirely absorbed in his niece's game, laughing at some absurdity of the fox's objection to the wedding. No trace of the careful, curtsying deference that so many adults performed in his presence. "I am told the fox has strong opinions," he said at last, and both of them looked up, startled, though Lucy only grinned and returned at once to her negotiations, entirely unbothered by her uncle's arrival. "He does not approve of the sheep's family," Elinor said, rising and dropping a proper curtsy this time, mindful now of exactly whose floor she knelt upon. "He believes the horse could do better." "The fox," the Duke observed, "sounds rather insufferable." "The fox," Elinor agreed, "has never once had to run into a burning building, so I find I cannot take his opinions terribly seriously." Something flickered across the Duke's face. Surprise, she thought, and then something warmer. Something that might have been the beginning of a smile, quickly restrained, as though he were unaccustomed to being spoken to so lightly and did not entirely know what to do with it. "Might I have a word with you, Miss Wren?" he asked. "In the library, if your patience with the fox's grievances can spare a quarter hour." Lucy, magnanimous in her happiness, waved them off with the air of a small monarch granting leave, already deep in negotiations over whether the wooden owl might serve as efficient, and Elinor followed the Duke down a corridor lined with portraits of Ashworth's long dead, their painted eyes seeming to track her progress with a scrutiny she felt keenly. The library, when they reached it, was a vast room of dark wood and tall windows, half its shelves scorched at one end, where the fire had briefly threatened before the servants had managed to contain it. The Duke gestured her to a chair near the hearth and took the one opposite, and for a moment he simply looked at her, his expression unreadable. "I have been trying to determine," he said at last, "the correct manner in which to thank a woman for saving my niece's life. I confess I have failed entirely. Money seems an insult. Words seem inadequate. I find myself, for the first time in some years, entirely at a loss." "You owe me no thanks at all, Your Grace," Elinor said, though she felt the heat rise in her cheeks at the directness of his gaze. "I did only what any decent person would." "You keep saying that," he said, "and I keep finding it untrue. I have lived among decent people my whole life, Miss Wren. Good, honourable, well-intentioned people, every one of them frozen upon my lawn while my house burned. Decency, I have learned, is not the same as courage. You possess both, and I do not know many who do." Elinor did not know how to answer this, and so she said nothing, and the silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable exactly, but charged with something she could not name. "My niece has asked that you be permitted to visit," the Duke said finally, in the tone of a man changing the subject, because he did not trust himself to remain upon the previous one. "She has taken what I might call a fierce attachment to you. I wonder whether you would consent to call upon her from time to time, not out of obligation, but if it would not trouble you overmuch. She lost her mother, my sister, 2 years past, and has not, I think, entirely recovered her trust in the safety of the world since. Your presence seems to steady her." It was, Elinor understood, both more and less than she had expected. Not a grand reward, not a purse of coins pressed into her hand and a polite dismissal, but a request, humbly made, that she continue to be present in a grieving child's life. She thought of Lucy's small hand in hers, of the fierce joy in the child's face at her arrival, and found she could not refuse even if she had wished to. "I would be glad to visit Your Grace," she said, "if it would help her." "It would," he said, and something in his voice, some quiet gratitude beneath the ducal formality, told her he meant it entirely. And so began a season Elinor would later think of as the strangest and sweetest of her life. Her visits to Ashcombe Hall, growing from occasional to regular, from formal to familiar, as autumn deepened into the first frosts of winter. She came twice weekly at first, then 3 times, ostensibly for Lucy's sake. And indeed the child's happiness at her arrival never dimmed. But Elinor began to notice, with a flutter of feeling she did not entirely trust, that the Duke himself began to appear more and more often during her visits, first for a few minutes, then for an hour, then, on one memorable afternoon, for the whole of a rainy day, when Lucy insisted that Uncle Julian must also learn the proper way to arrange a wooden animal wedding, and he had submitted to the lesson with a gravity that made Elinor laugh until her sides ached. She learned things about him in those weeks that the village gossip, for all its enthusiasm, had never captured. She learned that he had inherited the dukedom at 24, upon his father's sudden death, and had spent the years since laboring under a weight of responsibility that had left little room for anything resembling lightness. She learned that Lucy was the daughter of his younger sister, who had died of a fever 2 winters past, her husband having been lost at sea some months before that, leaving the girl entirely without parents, but for her uncle's guardianship. She learned that he read poetry in the evenings, though he would deny it if asked directly, and that he had a particular fondness for a battered volume of sonnets that lived, dog-eared and much-handled, upon the table beside his favourite chair. She learned, too, though this took longer and came with more difficulty, that he was lonelier than any man she had ever met. For all his title and his fortune and his fine house, that the weight of the dukedom had isolated him from the easy friendships of ordinary men, that his peers among the nobility valued his connections more than his company, that he had spent so many years being deferred to, that he had nearly forgotten what it felt like to be simply spoken to, laughed with, disagreed with, as Elinor found herself doing more and more freely as the weeks wore on. For his part, the Duke seemed to find in Elinor something he had not encountered in years of society dinners, and carefully arranged introductions to eligible young ladies of good family. She spoke to him without artifice, without the careful calculation she had watched other women employ in his presence, when circumstance occasionally brought her within sight of such encounters, the practiced laughter, the studied admiration, the careful angling toward matrimony that she recognized even from her position outside that world. Elinor asked after his health when he seemed tired. She teased him, gently, when he grew too grave. She argued with him about poetry, for she had strong opinions of her own, despite her modest education, opinions she had formed from the small collection of books her father kept, and the library at the vicarage, where the kindly vicar's wife had taught her to read as a girl, and the Duke found himself, to his own evident surprise, deferring to her judgment on more than one occasion. But the world outside Ashcombe Hall's walls was not so generous in its assessment of these visits, and it was not long before the whispers began. They started small, as such whispers always did, a raised eyebrow from the housekeeper, when Elinor arrived for her 4th visit in a fortnight, a pointed comment from a village matron, who had once employed Elinor's mother for mending, and now found occasion to remark, within Elinor's hearing, upon the impropriety of tradesmen's daughters presuming too far upon a great house's gratitude. By the time winter had fully settled over Ashcombe, the whispers had grown into something louder, uglier, a current of gossip that reached even Elinor's own kitchen, where her mother wrung her hands and asked, with poorly disguised anxiety, whether Elinor understood what people were saying. "They say you mean to trap him," her mother said one evening, not unkindly, but with the worry of a woman who had spent her whole life watching how quickly the world turned against those who reached above their station. "They say a duke does not spend his afternoons with a laundress's daughter unless he means something by it, or unless she means to make him mean something by it. I go for Lucy's sake," Elinor said, though even as she said it she felt the hollowness of the excuse, for she could no longer entirely convince herself that Lucy alone drew her back to Ashcombe Hall, week after week. "I believe you," her mother said gently. "But belief does not silence tongues, my love, and you have more to lose than he does, should the tongues turn cruel enough." Elinor knew this to be true, and the knowledge sat heavy in her chest through the following days, through a visit to the hall, where she found herself watching the Duke with new and unwelcome caution, weighing every warm word he spoke to her against the damage such warmth might do to her own reputation, her family's standing, her prospects in a village that would not soon forget if she was seen to have overreached. The Duke noticed the change in her at once. He had grown, in these weeks, remarkably attuned to the smallest shifts in her manner, and when Lucy had been put down for her afternoon rest, he found Elinor in the library, ostensibly returning a borrowed book, and asked, with the directness that had come to define their conversations, what troubled her. "There is talk in the village," she admitted, for she had found, somewhere in these weeks, that she could not easily lie to him. "About my visits here, about what they might mean." His expression darkened, not with anger at her, she understood, but with a weary recognition of a burden he had perhaps hoped to spare her. "I had feared as much," he said. "I am sorry for it. You have done nothing but show kindness to a grieving child, and for that you are made to suffer the ugliness of small minds." "It is not only small minds," Elinor said, forcing herself to continue though the words cost her something to speak. "It is the truth of things, Your Grace. I am the daughter of a shopkeeper. You are a duke. There is no version of this friendship that the world will permit to remain merely a friendship, in its own account of things. Sooner or later, I must either stop coming, or accept that my name will be spoken alongside yours in ways neither of us intended. And if I told you," he said slowly, "that I have, for some weeks now, found myself hoping that our friendship might become something more than the world's gossip has already assumed it to be, would that trouble you further, or ease it?" The library seemed very quiet in the wake of this question. Elinor felt her heart beating hard against her ribs, felt the old fear rise in her throat, the fear that she might be presuming too far, imagining feelings that existed nowhere but in her own foolish hopes. But she made herself meet his eyes, and what she found there was not the careless flattery of a man amusing himself with a pretty village girl, but something graver, something that looked, she thought, remarkably like her own uncertain hope reflected back at her. "It would trouble me," she said honestly, "because I do not know how such a thing could ever be permitted to flourish, given who we are. But it would not trouble me, because I do not want it. I think I have wanted it for some weeks now, and have been too afraid to name it, even to myself." He crossed the room to her then, slowly, as though giving her every opportunity to step back, and when she did not, he took her hand, the same hand still faintly scarred from the fire, and pressed it, with a gentleness that undid her entirely, to his lips. "Then let the village talk," he said quietly. "I have spent 5 years being careful, Miss Wren. Careful of my name, careful of my duty, careful of every alliance and every association, weighing each against what my father would have wished, what my position demands. I find I am tired of being careful. You ran into a burning house without once weighing the cost to yourself. I find I should like to learn that kind of courage from you." It was not a declaration so much as a beginning, and both of them seemed to understand this, for neither pressed further in that moment, content instead to sit together by the library fire as the afternoon light faded, speaking of small things, Lucy's latest opinions on wooden animal weddings, a book of poems he thought she might enjoy, the particular blue of the sky before a winter storm, while something unspoken and tender settled itself between them, patient as a seed waiting for spring. But the world, as Elinor had feared, was not content to let such tenderness grow unmolested. The trouble came, when it came, from a direction Elinor had not fully anticipated, not from the village gossips, whose whispers she had braced herself to weather, but from within the great house itself, from the Duke's own circle. A distant cousin of his, one Mr. Reginald Ashworth, arrived at the hall in the deep of winter under the pretense of a family visit, though it soon became clear to Elinor, watching him with the same wary attentiveness she had learned to apply to any newcomer at the hall, that his true purpose was rather more calculating. Mr. Ashworth was next in line for the dukedom should the Duke die without issue, a fact he seemed unable to forget for even a single conversation, and he regarded Elinor's presence at the hall, her easy familiarity with Lucy, her growing closeness to the Duke himself, with an expression of poorly concealed alarm that curdled, over the course of a fortnight's visit, into open hostility. "You must understand, Miss Wren," he said to her one afternoon, having contrived to find her alone in the garden while the Duke attended to estate business, that His Grace's position carries obligations beyond his own inclinations. A duke does not marry where his heart directs, but where his duty does. Surely a woman of your evident good sense understands this. "I understand a great many things, Mr. Ashworth," Elinor replied, refusing to let his condescension unsettle her outward composure, though it struck deeper than she cared to admit. Among them, that a man's cousin who stands to inherit his title has a particular interest in seeing that man remain unmarried, or married only where it serves the cousin's own security. Something flickered across Mr. Ashworth's face, surprise, she thought, at finding a village girl so unwilling to be cowed, but he recovered quickly, his smile turning colder. "You are clever," he said. "I will grant you that. But cleverness will not save you from what is coming, Miss Wren. I have written to certain persons of influence regarding this friendship. The kind of attention such letters invite is rarely kind to the woman involved. His Grace's reputation will weather it. Yours, I fear, will not. He was as good as his word." Within a fortnight, a scandal sheet in the nearest city had printed a scurrilous piece regarding the Duke of Ashcombe's unusual attachment to a tradesman's daughter, full of insinuation and invented detail, painting Elinor as a scheming opportunist who had engineered her way into a grieving child's affections in pursuit of a ducal fortune. The piece found its way, inevitably, back to Ashcombe village, where it did precisely the damage Mr. Ashworth had intended. Her father's shop, which had weathered gossip before without serious harm, began to see custom fall away as certain families found new reasons to take their trade elsewhere. Her mother wept over the household accounts by candlelight, though she never once reproached Elinor for the cause of their trouble. And Elinor herself, walking through the village she had known her whole life, found faces that had once greeted her warmly now turned away, or worse, regarded her with the particular pitying contempt reserved for women thought to have overreached and been justly humbled for it. She did not go to the hall for a week after the scandal sheet's arrival, unable to bear the thought of what her presence there might now be costing him, unwilling to be the instrument of further damage to a name that had done nothing but show her kindness. She told herself this was wisdom, was sacrifice, was the proper action of a woman who understood her place, but in the quiet of her own room at night she wept for the loss of it, for Lucy's small face and the Duke's rare unguarded laughter and the library fire and all the tender ordinary happiness she had allowed herself to hope for. It was Lucy in the end who brought them back together, though the child had no notion of the role she played in it. The letter arrived on a grey morning in the second week of Elinor's self-imposed absence, written in a child's careful, uneven hand, the ink blotted in places where small fingers had pressed too hard upon the pen. "Dear Miss Wren," it read, "You have not come to see me, and I do not understand why. Uncle Julian says you are very busy, but I do not believe him because he looks sad when he says it, and he never looks sad about things that are only busy. Please come back. The wooden fox says the wedding cannot happen without you, because you are meant to be the owl who says the words, and no one else will do. And the horse is very cross about the delay. I miss you very much. Your friend, Lucy Elinor, read the letter 3 times, and on the 3rd reading found she could not sit still a moment longer. She told her mother she was walking to clear her head, and instead found her feet carrying her, as they had carried her once before without permission from her thinking mind. Up the long drive to Ashcombe Hall, she found the Duke in the library, not reading, not attending to correspondence, but simply standing at the tall windows looking out over the grey winter garden with an expression of such weary sorrow that Elinor's resolve to remain composed nearly failed her at once. "Your Grace," she said from the doorway, and he turned so quickly that she understood, in that single motion, how very much her absence had cost him. Elinor. It was the first time he had used her given name without title, and it landed in the quiet room like something sacred. "I had begun to fear you would not return. I did not think it fair to you," she said, "to let my presence continue to bring such trouble upon your name." "My name," he said, crossing the room toward her with a directness that made her breath catch, "has weathered a great many things in 6 generations, Elinor. It weathered my grandfather's gambling debts, and my great-aunt's scandalous elopement, and my own father's rather too public grief when my mother died. It will weather this. What it will not weather, I find, is my own misery at your absence, which I have discovered these past days to be considerably more painful than any scandal sheet's invention." "Mr. Ashworth," she began. "Mr. Ashworth," the Duke said, with a coldness Elinor had not heard from him before, "has been asked to leave Ashcam Hall and not return. Once I discovered the source of that particular piece of journalism. I do not take kindly to my family using a child's rescuer as a weapon in their own petty ambitions for my title. He may inherit the dukedom one day should I die without an heir, but he will not do so by driving away the one person who has made this house feel like something other than a burden these 5 years." Elinor felt tears rise, unbidden, at the fierceness in his voice, at the plain declaration beneath the anger, that she had mattered to him, had changed something in him, in ways he was no longer troubling to hide. "The village still talks," she said softly. "My father's trade still suffers for it. I do not know that my presence here can ever be entirely free of that cost." "Then let me address the cost directly," he said, and something in his tone shifted, grew graver, more deliberate, and Elinor understood, with a sudden dizzying certainty, what was coming before he had spoken another word. "I have spent a great many hours these past days considering how a man addresses a wrong such as this, Elinor, and I have concluded there is only one remedy that answers it fully. Not further gratitude, not compensation for your father's losses, though I intend to see those addressed as well, but an answer to the gossip itself, a plain and public one, that leaves no doubt as to what you are to me, and no room for scandal sheets to invent what they do not understand." He knelt then, there in the library, where they had spent so many quiet afternoons, before the fire that had once nearly consumed his home, and had instead, in some strange alchemy of grief and courage, brought her into his life. "I love you," he said simply. "I have loved you, I think, since the moment you walked back into a burning house for the 4th time, not because anyone commanded it of you, but because you could not bear to leave another soul behind. I did not know, that day, that I was watching the woman I would spend the rest of my days trying to deserve. I know it now. Will you marry me, Elinor Wren, and let the whole of Ashcombe, village and hall alike, see exactly what I think of the woman who saved everything I hold dear?" Elinor found she could not speak for a long moment, her heart too full, the weight of weeks of fear and hope and careful restraint finally breaking loose all at once. When she did speak, it was through tears she made no effort to hide. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will marry you." He rose and kissed her then, gently, as though she were something precious and hard-won, and from the doorway, for children have an uncanny sense for exactly the moment adults least expect them, came a small, delighted shriek, and Lucy came running across the library floor to fling herself against both of them at once, demanding to know whether this meant Miss Wren would come and live at the Hall forever, and whether she might finally be allowed to preside over the wooden animal wedding as originally planned, now that the real wedding was settled. The wedding itself, when it came in the following spring, was neither so grand nor so cold as village gossip had once predicted a duke's wedding must be. It took place in the small chapel on the Ashcombe grounds, rather than in some distant cathedral, filled not only with the nobility of the county, but with half the village besides, Elinor's parents seated in a place of honour near the front. The servants who had once been carried from a burning house standing proudly among the guests, Mrs. Pruitt weeping openly through the entire ceremony with her silver spoons. It was rumoured, tucked safely into her reticule, for luck. Lucy, dressed in white and crowned with spring flowers, walked before the bride carrying a small wooden basket in which, to the amusement of the assembled guests, she had insisted on placing the wooden fox, the wooden horse, and the wooden sheep, declaring that they too deserved to see a proper wedding at last after so long a wait. When the vicar pronounced them wed, and the Duke turned to kiss his bride before the assembled county, Elinor thought back, as she would many times in the years that followed, to that first terrible afternoon. The smoke rising over the hedgerows, the basket of linens dropped into the mud, the wall of fire she had walked into without a single thought for herself. She had gone into that burning house to save whoever she could find, never once imagining that what she would find, in the end, was not merely a child's life restored to her family, but her own life entirely transformed. A home, a love, a place in a story she could never have written for herself, had courage not carried her, that autumn afternoon, through a door that most would have feared to open. Ashcombe Hall stood rebuilt by the time their first child was born the following winter, its west wing restored, its scars healed over with new stone and fresh timber, though the Duke had insisted, against his steward's advice, on preserving a single scorched beam above the nursery door, as a quiet remembrance of the day everything had changed. Lucy grew up beneath that beam, and in time so did her small cousins, and the story of the woman who ran into the fire and found not only a duke's gratitude, but a duke's whole and undivided heart became, in the village of Ashcombe, not merely a tale told at the well, but a piece of the very fabric of the place, proof, told and retold through generations, that courage asked no permission from rank or fortune before it acted, and that love, when it came, cared nothing at all for the differences the world was so determined to enforce between a laundress's daughter and the man who would spend the whole of his life trying, and always succeeding, to deserve her.